What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today we have another edition of the unscripted, unedited show, the Overthinking MTG podcast, where we're going to be looking at Skyswimmer Koi. Now, you may be wondering, why in the heck are we looking at this random common from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty? Well, it is in fact random. What I did was I actually grabbed a number of random cards, just going to scryfall.com and clicking the random card button 4 times, and I put a poll out on my YouTube channel where a number of folks, actually 118 people, did end up voting on it, which is super cool. And of all the random cards that we got, Skyswimmer Koi won. So here we are. We're going to be talking about Skyswimmer Koi today. And also keep an eye out on the community tab of the YouTube channel for future polls for other random episodes. So Skyswimmer Koi is a 3/3 fish for 3 into blue with flying. And whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. And then also the flavor text, once they swam alone among the clouds, but now the people of Kamigawa have built high enough to reach them. That's actually, I gotta say, flavorfully, this is really cool. The idea that these are, like, notably, actually, now that I'm looking at it, knowing Kamigawa, I'm very surprised that this fish does not have the spirit type as well. Because on Kamigawa, there are a lot of different kinds of creatures just in general. Although now that I think about it, the Soratami, the moon folk, are like rabbit-like people, and they are not spirits, yet they live in the clouds and they can fly. So I don't see why, now that I think about it, okay, flying fish could absolutely just exist on this plane, because Kamigawa is freaking dope. There's a reason that so many people wanted to go back there, even though the first block, honestly, the majority of the cards from that block were pretty lackluster, with some notable exceptions, of course, but yeah, in general, it was a relative flop, which is a shame because you get really cool stuff like this. But I'm glad we came back. So the idea of a fish that swims in the sky is already kind of evocative and kind of beautiful. And clouds, I mean, they are made up of water vapor, right? So the notion of the skies being kind of a reflection of the sea, I find very evocative and very cool. And then on top of that, to juxtapose that with the urbanization, the industrialization, that's the word I'm looking for, of Tawashi and other cities like it on Kamigawa. The fact that the skyscrapers have now reached the clouds to the point where, as people are going about their day-to-day lives, the koi themselves are swimming amongst them. I love that. It's so cool. So mechanically, is the card any good? So flavorfully, we have a slam dunk. This is definitely on one single piece of artwork, one piece of flavor text, we get a beautiful snapshot into how this world has changed, but how it coexists with the majesty and the beautiful fantasy elements that exist there. So I gotta say, flavorfully, slam dunk. This card, honestly, the more I look at it and the more I think about it, really captures what made Kamigawa Neon Dynasty so interesting from a lore and flavor perspective. This is it, all on one card, and that's rad. And the fact that we get that kind of flavor injected into our commons is exactly what we want to see. Just like how, when you look at currency, getting your face on the lower denomination of bills is generally considered a higher honor than the higher denomination because people see them and circulate them. And, so George Washington being on the $1 bill here in the United States, like, that's a great honor for the first president of the United States. And so the fact that this common is carrying so much kind of narrative load and bringing with it so much immersion to players, I love that. So the card itself, 3/3 flyer for 4, is not amazing by today's standards. Unfortunately, it just isn't. I mean, we're at a point now where we definitely see it a lot in red, where a 4/4 flyer for 4 is not enough. It just doesn't hang. And so a 3/3 flyer for 4, as you can imagine, definitely doesn't hang. It's just understated for what you get by today's standards, outside of limited. So, as far as constructed is concerned, this card is just not big enough. You don't get a big enough body. And then you want to be in situations where artifacts are coming into the battlefield under your control. Whether you're casting artifact spells or generating artifact tokens, be those food, blood, treasure, etc. It can do a lot. So if you have I suppose in a commander deck, especially one that can take advantage of the graveyard, if you're generating a lot of tokens that happen to be artifacts. So if you're in situations where you have a tireless tracker, academy manufacturer, anything that's producing mites, even, like, there's so many different kinds of tokens that are incidentally artifacts. If you can take advantage of an effect like this in those decks, it's going to be good because it doesn't trigger once per turn. This triggers any number of times. However, you're not truly drawing cards because you have to draw, then discard. So you're getting card selection, you're seeing more cards. So Skyswimmer Koi is going to help you dig for an answer, but it cannot by itself generate card advantage. You definitely have to be aware of that. So if you care about your graveyard, if you're in situations where discarding is a benefit, then all of a sudden this can get you there, which is pretty cool. But in a lot of situations, you don't necessarily want discard and artifacts. A lot of the time, those, they don't always go together. There are exceptions to that. Like if you were to do, say, a Grixis, like Vampire's Madness situation, then you might have a deck that is producing blood tokens regularly, which is triggering the Koi, and then the blood tokens could also be sacrificed, and in that case, you might have Madness cards. So there's a use. So if you're doing that in Commander and you're looking for kind of a budget option that can help kind of get the engine churning, Skyswimmer Koi's not bad. And having a 3/3 flyer, it does give you a body that is relevant if understated for its cost. So your opponents do have to answer it, which is real. Now, in draft, this card is a house and a half because if you can get 3 power in the air in a lot of situations, that's just going to win you a game. Like, there are some games where just slapping your opponent for 3 every turn in the sky is the way to break parity and close out a game. So in limited, Skyswimmer Koi is actually a very strong common that just gets the job done. And it happens to be in a set with a lot of artifacts, in a ton of artifact creatures that are just... There were a lot of creatures in that set where if you looked at the art, you just thought, oh, this is a creature with maybe some biomechanical like enhancements, but they were typed as artifact creatures. Cards like Virus Beetle or the Hotshot Mechanic come to mind, where it's not super clear they're artifacts, but they definitely are. And, those would trigger Skyswimmer Kois. There are also vehicles and a handful of equipment, if I'm not mistaken, that were okay, if not amazing. But all the same, artifacts are going to be entering the field. And so you're going to get advantage of this if you're in that limited environment. So honestly, this is one of those cards, if I open this in a sealed pool, I am seriously looking at my blue to see if I can make this work. And it is splashable as well, being 3 and a blue. So it's not bad. So yeah, those are the 2 spaces where I can see this card really shining in budget commander builds where you're doing a lot of artifacts and you like discarding. So there are probably a lot of decks that enjoy that. The first one that came to my mind was like Grixis Vampires. But do with that what you will and find... I was thinking Evelyn the Covetous could be a really good commander for a deck like that. I might have to tinker with this. But yeah, but limited and casual commander are really where I see this card. It is a bulk common. It doesn't really, it's not expensive, and there's a reason for that. Just because it's kind of everywhere and its uses are limited. So here we are. That said, the ability to trigger every time an artifact enters the field, kind of artifact fall, if you will, is something that we haven't seen on a lot of cards throughout Magic's history. I was doing a little bit of research before firing up the recording for this, and I found there were fewer than 30 cards that actually included the text whenever an artifact enters the battlefield. I was expecting significantly more than that, but it turns out that's actually not as common as I would have expected, and a lot of them actually have shown up in recent sets. So similar to Skyswimmer Koi, in the Neon Dynasty Commander product, we got Kappa Cannoneer. Now, in many situations where you would want the Skyswimmer Koi, you would prefer Kappa Cannoneer. This thing is a 4/4 with Improvise, so your artifacts can help pay for it. It's kind of a fixed affinity, if you will. And then it also has Ward 4, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it becomes unblockable for the turn. So this card is very, very potent if you have a lot of artifacts, and if artifacts are entering the battlefield consistently. It's going to provide a beat stick that can just absolutely end the game. It doesn't give you the card selection that Skyswimmer Koi does, but it has kind of a similar vibe, and it's going to be a way to end the game, which is really, really powerful. There were a couple of others that I would just want to call out that might work in similar deck styles. We also have things like Reckless Fireweaver, that when an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So, it's just, as artifacts are entering, you're just pinging. That's a very potent effect, and I know I've seen a lot of, like, aggressive red decks really take advantage of this. We also have Teething Wormlet, which, if you're in green, it's similar to to the Skyswimmer Koi. Well, actually, no, it's still not, because a lot of these creatures that we're looking at, they turn the artifact ETB into power on the board or damage. And that's very, very common. There are a lot of those throughout the course of the game. In a way, Skyswimmer Koi is kind of unique in the way it functions, which is both good and bad. Because on the one hand, it makes it special and it makes it stand out. So that's something. However, what it's providing is relatively narrow because there isn't as much support. It's not an effect you want in any kind of redundancy, and such redundancy just doesn't exist. So, I don't know, it's an interesting build, it's an interesting idea. As far as the other artifact fall cards, there's one that I found while doing research for this that I hadn't thought of in at least 15 years that has me honestly intrigued, and I'm seriously wondering if I can make it work in Commander. And that is Vermiculous, or Vermiculous. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that. It is a 1/4 for 4 and a black, and it is a horror. So a 1/4 for 5, it better be fantastic, right? That text box has got to be dope. It has, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, Vermiculous gets +4/+4 until end of turn. So if an artifact enters the battlefield, it's a 5/5. If multiple artifacts enter the battlefield, it gets even bigger. So if you're in a situation where you can just rock out 3 or 4 treasure tokens or blood tokens in your turn, this thing is going to be nothing short of massive. The problem is, the moment you pass the turn and you get past the cleanup phase and somebody else goes to their upkeep, it's back to being a 1/1. And so all of a sudden, something like a Disfigure or an Orcish Bowmasters, of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, or even a Spikefield Hazard can kill your 5-drop. So unless you have some way to like instant speed create artifacts, this card is genuinely terrible because it's just so fragile. But at the same time, like, this is the jank that I live for. This is the kind of dumb nonsense that if it pops, it's going to be amazing. But the downside is just way too strong. So it's funny, actually, Vermiculous is kind of the extreme example of the kind of cards that the Skyswimmer Koi decks would want, all right? Where you have a lot of artifacts entering and you can get the ETBs. Vermiculous is very, very fragile, very inefficient, but the ceiling is huge. Meanwhile, I feel like Skyswimmer Koi, it's nowhere near as explosive, and it's actually pretty understated. Like, when this is on the field in a commander pod, I don't think anybody's going to be trying to get rid of this, really. Like, it's not the threat. You know, when people are playing out their permanents, or if I'm sitting on removal and somebody has this on the field, when I'm looking for what to blow up with my Binding of the Old Gods or my Utter End, Skyswimmer Koi is not. You know, it's not a consideration. It's very understated. That said, if it can allow you to filter your hand 3 or 4 times in the course of a game, that's very real value. Card selection, like looting effects like this, they are not threatening. People don't realize just how good they are compared to just drawing a card, but they are. They're actually really freaking strong. So honestly, I think the card is better than it looks, but it is a narrow use case, and there are a ton in the market. So it's dirt cheap. If you're doing any kind of budget artifacts, something in Commander, and you're in blue, consider putting Skyswimmer Koi in the mix, because it might actually, I don't know, you never know. It could go a long way. But yeah, low power Commander is where I think this card would shine. But if you have an idea on how to use this card in maybe a higher tier environment or in more competitive settings, please let me know in the comments below. I'm very curious to see if there are any use cases that I just am not aware of. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a comment, and while you're down there, go ahead and like and subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube. Also, it's available as an audio podcast as well. So thank you so much, and I'll catch you on the next one.